Now, when it comes to deploying NextJS apps, there are different hosting providers you can use. And there are different ways of configuring your project as well. You can, for example, use environment variables, for example, to hold things like your database credentials. I'll not dive into that here. I do in my full NextJS course though. But for this example here, we'll just keep the credentials stored here in this code. And from a security perspective, this is fine, by the way, because this code will never end up on the client. It just might be inconvenient to use one and the same database and one and the same user for development and for production, but for this demo, this does not matter. So I'll stick to this approach here. And regarding the hosting provider, I will use Vercel. Vercel is a great hosting provider for NextJS applications because Vercel actually is a hosting provider by the same team that developed NextJS. So it's really embracing NextJS and optimized for NextJS, if you want to put it like this. And deploying NextJS applications to Vercel is thankfully also extremely simple. Now, what you'll need to do to start deploying is sign up with a Git repository provider. Because with Vercel, you will directly link your GitHub repository, which holds your source code, for example, to Vercel, and they will then get your source code from that repository and deploy it for you. Therefore, you need to use GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket, which are Git repository providers, to put your code there before you can deploy it with Vercel. Now here I will use GitHub, which arguably is the biggest and most popular Git repository provider, and I already did log in with my account here. Once you did create an account and log in, it's free, you can create a new repository. And you can give this repository any name you want, like Next.js course demo or anything like this. You can also give it a description and then choose whether it should be public or private. If it's public, everyone can see it. Everyone can see your code. If it's private, only people you grant access to can view it. And I'll go with private here, but either of the options can be correct. It simply depends on which kind of project it is. If it's an open source project, it will probably be public. So I'll go with private and create my repository. Once that is created, you need to push your code here. Now for that, you need to install Git on your local system, and you can get Git from git-scm.com. It's available for all operating systems. You can download the installer from there and simply walk through it to install Git on your system. And once you installed Git on your local system, you can create a so-called commit in your project, a code snapshot, you could say, and then push that commit, that repository as a whole actually, to GitHub, to move your code with your code history to GitHub. Now, I won't turn this course into a Git course. If you want to learn more about Git and GitHub, we got a standalone course on that which you can take. Here, I will assume that you have those Git basics and that you have Git installed now. And if you have it installed, you can then go back into your local project, into your project folder, and create a code snapshot, a commit as it's called. You do this by running git add dot, and you can run this if you got Git installed, and then git commit and then some message of your choice. For example, ready for deployment, though typically you want to add commit messages that describe what you changed. But with that, I now created such a snapshot, such a commit, and now we're ready for deployment. Now that means that now we need to push our code to GitHub. For this, we can grab this URL here, which will point to the repository we created, and in our local project folder, run git remote add origin and paste that URL in here. Now, depending on whether you worked with Git and GitHub before or not, you might want to add your GitHub username here in front of github.com. If you did work with GitHub before and push before, you probably don't need to do that. But if you never pushed anything to GitHub, adding this will ensure that you're prompted for your password and that you have a chance of entering your credentials. Because of course you'll need to authenticate yourselves in order to successfully push to this repository. You can't just start pushing to some random repositories which you don't own. So therefore here, I will now add this origin here, and then run git push -- all. And this will now push our code here. Now you might be prompted for your password here, and you can then enter your GitHub password or use a token for authentication. For this, to generate such a token, you need to go to your GitHub settings, and then there, go to developer settings, personal access tokens, and generate a new token here. Once you confirm this with your password, you can add some node here like NextJS deployment or a more general purpose. And then under scopes, select repo, delete repo, and admin repo hook here. And then generate a token. And now you'll need to copy that token here, which is showing up here, and enter this as a password when you're prompted for it. Once you did all of that and you pushed successfully, you should see your code in this repository which you just created in the main branch. And now we can link this repository to Vercel to start deploying. Now before we do that, let me talk about building for production and what Vercel actually does. Vercel is a hosting provider which you can not just use for Next.js, you can also use them for other projects, but which definitely is optimized for Next.js. So whilst you can host other things there as well, and it might be optimized for those other types of projects as well, it is definitely optimized for Next.js. And that means that you can just connect Vercel to your GitHub repository, and Vercel will build and then deploy and start your project for you. So you don't need to run any build command on your own, Vercel will do that for you. Nonetheless, I want to show you what Vercel does. And therefore I'm back in our local code here. And there in package.json, we see a couple of scripts, which are commands we can execute in this project. We worked a lot with the dev script to start this development server, and that is the script which we use during local development. But we can also run the build script to build our project for production, so to optimize all our code, minify it, and so on. And you want to run this if you do deploy it on another host which does not build the project for you. So we don't need to do it with Vercel, but you might need to do it for other hosting providers. And then once you run this command, this will give you a .next folder which contains some of these optimized files. For example, this .next folder will also contain all those pre-generated page files, those HTML files for your pages, like the starting page here, or the individual meetup detail pages. So this is what npm run build will do for you, and Vercel will execute this command on our behalf on their servers. So we don't need to do that. But if you would host your project on another server, which you manage yourself, for example, you need to run npm run build, and thereafter, with npm start, you can start a production server. So now again, we have a running server, but this is now the production server which you could start on a remote machine which you administer yourself to run the server for your next application. And that server therefore should of course stay up and running on that machine to which you deployed your application as long as you want to expose it to the world. Now I will quit it here though. Now all of that will be done by Vercel. And therefore let's now go back to Vercel and continue with GitHub here. And now here we'll need to link GitHub to Vercel. Now you are then prompted to give Vercel certain permissions, give it access to your repositories, and I'll do that here. And once you did that, you can select that repository, which we created a couple of minutes ago here, and connect it to Vercel. So I'll click import here on that repository. Now we'll select this personal account here. You might be prompted to create an account here, and there you want to choose the personal one, which is free to use or free to get started. Definitely check out their pricing pages to learn more about the different options you have there. And with that, we now can configure how our code should be pulled and how the project should be built. And all the defaults here typically should work for you. It detected that it's a Next.js project, the default build and output settings work for us, and we could override environment variables here if we would be using any, but we aren't, and hence we can just click deploy. Now, to ensure that it really works, we'll also need to go to MongoDB Atlas and change something here. There, under network access, you will need to make sure that you allow access from anywhere. This ensures that the Vercel servers on which our application will run will be able to connect to MongoDB. Otherwise, this will fail and our data can't be loaded and stored. So we need to grant this access. We still, of course, use our credentials for actually establishing the connection, but we need to open up that global access to allow Vercel and its servers, and our code running on their servers, to connect to MongoDB. Now, it can take a while until this operation is done, so let's wait for this. And once it's done, here we actually see an error that connection failed because I just changed it after starting the deploy. But we can simply hit deploy again and start a new deploy, which should now succeed because now we did open up MongoDB for outside access. So let's now wait whether that now starts up successfully here. It definitely built our site successfully here, that's good. And that is looking good. Now we can click visit and we see our site up and running on Vercel's servers here. We can also try adding a meetup here. Test Street 5, this is a test, and see whether that works. And it does. It might not show up immediately on this page, because this page is statically generated and then only revalidated once every second for incoming requests. And then it needs to be pre-generated again. So even after 1 second, it might not show up immediately. But eventually we see our new meetup here. And we can't visit it here though. We get a 404 error here. And that's actually an expected error at this point. What's the problem here?